Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this podcast on the risks and possible scenarios of the forthcoming European elections. I am Nico Heller, and this is Reboot 2030, a Democracy School podcast. My guest today is Susanna Cafaro. Susanna is a European federalist and a professor of European Union law at the University of Salento in Italy. She was awarded a Chamonix chair from the European Commission, first in 2019 and then again in 2023. She's also authored and edited numerous books and written more than 50 scholarly articles and book chapters. At the moment, I believe she's in Italy. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I believe she's in Poland, and she is meant to join us from there. A minute ago, she was online, but she has disappeared. And I don't know whether she has lost her connection or what has happened, but for some reason, she has disappeared. So let's hope that she's joining me now. I've just sent her a message. She was live, she was here a minute ago, but for some reason, now there she is. There she is. Thank God she is back. Now let me invite her in before she disappears again. Susanna, now
Hi,
you're
Nico.
live. I'm so glad. You were there earlier, and then you disappeared. And I was getting you might have lost your connection. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Happy
You
to be here.
Nice to meet you. You are in Poland, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm Warsaw.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's quite a kind of a fitting kind of location to talk to me from, because of course Poland. Now we're talking about the European elections today, and of course Poland has for many years been a sort of a problem child of European democracy. But of course with Tusk back in the sort of the driving seat, there is some hope that Poland might catch up. But of course, the Peace Party, I believe, has put as many hurdles in his way as they possibly can. Before we start talking about Europe, what's your sort of impression about Poland at this very point? Do you have a sort of just a few comments about the sort of the state of Polish democracy at this point?
Well, it's an interesting angle to look at European politics from, because as you perfectly know, there are about 3 million of Ukrainians actually in Poland. And it's the border of the Western world, and it's the border with the war. So here, the common defense policy, which is an hot topic right away right now in the European politics, is a very hot topic. And so we can see from moving from a country to another that the priorities change, and they have to be accommodated somehow in the big scheme of European politics.
That's right, but there seems to be a common trend, across much of Europe, and I believe there was a really quite an interesting article in the Guardian newspaper, I believe today, but it might be a day or two old. I'm not sure. But it was very much going almost country by country, looking at all the different countries and the sort of the state of democracy in those countries. It is quite shocking. I mean, especially coming from a sort of a German perspective, where we have historically great experience with sort of far-right politics and sort of fascist politics, and to see some kind of reemergence of fascism and of far-right politics across Europe, not as a sort of a one-off or kind of an outlier, but almost as if it's a sort of a contemporary current that is very much gaining the upper hand. What is when you look across Europe as a sort of as a democracy sort of expert, what is your kind of, where do you see this headed? Should we be worried about this?
Well, my impression, also talking with colleagues from other European countries, is that there is quite a general concern about European elections, because there is this significant increase in numbers everywhere in Europe of the right-wing parties, even far right. And of course, we all wonder how these parties will work together in the European Parliament. Because, there is a little paradox about this kind of parties, because as they all have this priority of putting their national country first, because this is what nationalism is about, it's difficult for these countries also to be a bloc, because, they have much in common, but this having things in common is not really the ingredient to work together, as is not in their DNA, let's say. And so I really wonder how, not only how they will work together, if they will work together, but how they will contribute, if they are willing to contribute somehow to European politics. Because whatever is a progress in a European politics often is somehow a sort of step back or retrenching of national politics to accommodate more European politics. There is a sort of contradiction.
Absolutely. Now, let's sort of go back one step. Of course, there's a big difference between a member state and democracy at a state level and democracy at the European level. To put it very simply, if a majority of parliamentarians hold seats on the far right, they will form a government. So if you have, like a majority of AfD or Peace or Sweden Democrats or whatever, Vox, then they will form a government. And then you will have a far-right government. Now, Europe works differently. It's not a case of us voting for MEPs, European members of parliament, and whoever then has the majority forms a European government. That's not how it works, is it? So there is a kind of a fundamental difference between the European level and supranational democracy and the national level. And I think in terms of the actual threat, it's very interesting and important to look at those differences, because of course, most people, when they are worrying about sort of a takeover of the European Parliament or European politics by the far right, they have a national model, a sort of a nation-state model of democracy in mind. And of course, that isn't the case. Could you just talk a little bit about the differences between European democracy and sort of nation-state level democracy, and also what scope sort of a majority of parliamentarians would have to influence politics and government or governance at that level, just to kind of make that difference clear?
Thank you for this great question, because I really like the idea of clarifying things for people, because there are lots of misunderstandings there. European politics, I think few know that Europe is a democratic in a different way, but it's democratic. And then that most of European decisions, and for sure all the decisions which are basically legislative in nature, come from a two-chamber system, the two chambers being the European Parliament and the Council of the Union. Now, the difference with the national politics is that when we have two chambers in the national parliaments, they are somehow the product of the same political body, the same kind of elections. And so usually you have the same majority in both. And then, of course, the government reflects this majority, but there are the same proportions, let's say, between the majority and the defeated parties. Instead, vice versa, in the European legal institutional framework, we have parliament, which reflects the electoral body. And so, let's say, by hypothesis, the right-wing parties win, they will be the biggest group in the European Parliament, because MPs there sit not by nationality, but by political affiliation. Conversely, in the Council of the Union, each member represents its own country. So this means that we will have only the majorities there. We won't have the oppositions, because only the governments will be represented. So if we have a a significant number of governments with the right-wing majority, we will have only them in representing the countries in the council. And so this means that if what happens is similar to what happened 5 years ago in the parliament, we didn't have a single party winning the majority, so we had sort of what in Germany you would call grosse Koalition in the European Parliament, 5 different political groups supporting the new European Commission in 2019. So a compromise government, let's say. While in the council, the majorities change according to national elections. If these hypotheses will occur this time, we could have 2 different majorities in the council and in the parliament. And this means that it will be very difficult to adopt whatever legislative act. Something similar, if you want, to what happens in the United States when the president and the Congress reflect different majorities. So 2 major institutional bodies conflicting between them. So it's tricky because we are going to elect the parliament, but the council is merely the result of national elections, so may be completely different from the parliament.
But this is a really interesting sort of dynamic, if you like, because what you have, of course, is you've got sort of a multi-level governance system. And at one level, it is the citizens of Europe who vote directly members into the European Parliament. And at the other level, you have the council, where there's an indirect kind of democracy in a sense that we elect our national governments, which then basically are represented in the council. So this 2-tier system, as you said, quite rightly, kind of creates potentially a situation where, say, at the council, you have a sort of a right-wing majority or vice versa, and at the parliament, the other way around, and then you get this deadlock situation. So that's, of course, one deadlock that you can get. So it's really worth looking then, how many of the kind of, member states are kind of moving to the right, and what is that trend, and how will that, because of course European member state elections, they don't all happen at the same time, so it they happen at various times throughout the year, and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of a different timeline there as well, and if there's a shift to the right at this upper level, at the level of governments, then that happens on a different time scale from the direct elections coming up at the European Parliament. But the trend obviously is, if you like, one would assume the same. I mean, if people vote for right-wing parties at a European level, you would think that they might do the same thing eventually at the nation-state level. It's just maybe there's a sort of a time lag between the two. Now, there's another risk, of course, and that's within the Parliament itself. I understand that there has been, partially because the European Parliament is a little bit removed from the day-to-day grind of kind of realpolitik. So it's been a bit more civil, a bit more, in some ways, more substantive than national politics often are, which are very much closer to the citizen, and therefore often also more populist. Now, is there sort of at the level of the Parliament itself, do you see any danger that the European Parliament will become more populist as well as a result of these elections? Because that, again, would be a new trend that so far really was not so much of a problem at the European Parliament.
Well, if this is what will happen, it's quite worrisome, because as the European Parliament has always been, until now, a strong supporter of European integration. And so, in a certain sense, the dynamics has always been, until now, that Commission and the Parliament promote European integration, while the Council is a sort of break, because it defends national interests, an addition of national interests. And so this is usually the dynamic and the negotiation between the two. In this case, if both are, the 2 chambers are against European integration, this means that we are facing a stop in European legislation, in European progress of common politics. So it's this is, and also the other factor we have to take into consideration is that the Commission is usually a reflection of the European elections, because not everybody knows, but the Commission, the President of the Commission is appointed after the European elections by the European Council, which is the Council of Heads of States and Governments. And but it enters into its position after the endorsement by the European Parliament, which is necessary. And then the European Council, together with the President of the Commission, pick up from a number of national suggestions, government suggestions, the number of commissioners, which are the ministers of the Union in a sense. And these let's say, candidate commissioners will face auditions in the European Parliament, each of them, and the Parliament has to approve each of them. So in the past, also some candidates have been also rejected by the European Parliament. So it's quite strong, the role of the European Parliament in approving or not approving the Commission. And the majority of the Parliament usually is reflected by the names you see in the list of the commissioners, because otherwise they would never be endorsed. So this means that if we have a center-right parliament, we will have a center-right commission, which is also endangers also the power of initiative in the European system, because the commission is formally the independent body which is in charge for the initiative of legal acts, but then we need approval of both Parliament and Council. And having a proactive commission has been until now the recipe for having European politics as we know it, because all the major decisions come from proposals by the Commission. I could mention the Next Generation EU, the Green Deal, the Energy Compact, the migration, the recent migration agreement. So all come from proposals from the Commission. So if the Commission stops making ambitious proposals, which usually are also reduced, let's say, by the amendments in the Parliament, the Commission, then all the politics will downgrade somehow.
No, this is right. This is right, but this actually, one could actually take this a step further, this argument. You're talking about less ambitious proposals. What about outright reactionary proposals? You can see how this could actually flick. I mean, so far, and I think this has to do with the sort of the European project and where it's come from and its place in people's sort of hearts and minds. It's been a progressive project. It's been it's been a sort of a unifying, a positive project. And so much that has come out has been about improving the quality of life, improving the environment, improving justice and standards and so forth. It was about making things better for all. And so in many instances, it was a break on reactionary politics. And we see this, for example, in the UK, who's left the EU, the way environmental standards have deteriorated in the UK, the way they have dropped one European environmental standard after the other, because they don't no longer have to abide by them. And you can see how that positive influence is now essentially gone, and the UK is going a very different direction for now. It might change with the new government. So there's that. So it could flick, and from being a very positive influence, anything from working time directives, you name it, to safety issues, to environmental standards, you name it, food standards. You could go on and on and on, where we have all massively benefited. And then, of course, you could go on to things like the 4 freedoms, mobility and so on and so forth. We see already kind of borders being reinforced again. There is now Germany is having border controls again with Poland, and so forth. Sweden has controls with, like with Germany as well, passport controls and so on and so forth. It's of course about monitoring migration, across Europe. Now, but these are trends that have started under this administration. But of course, with a shift to the right, you can see how they would become more pronounced and how that would more and more shape sort of European policy in the longer term. Now, there's one thing that I find interesting, and it's a sort of a difficult one to frame, and this is this whole thing about change. I mean, you're talking about sort of the next generation Europe. and the way that kind of move is sort of, in a way, endangered or is kind of threatened by the deadlocks that might emerge and and so forth. But there's another thing that, of course, is also comes under the umbrella of change, and that's a sort of an unraveling of the EU, sort of a kind of an undoing, going backwards. I'll give you an example. I mean, years ago, when I was quite active in the sort of the refugee movement, a lot of us felt that the Geneva Convention on refugees was too narrow, and there was a sort of a strong debate whether we should actually open this up or campaign for it to be opened up to allow more people protection under that convention. But there was a consensus. If we were to open this up, the opposite would happen. People would water it down, and we would never, ever get the standard that we now have. Now, I wonder with the EU, which is a totally different thing, but again, there's this question about opening things up. Do you see a danger that reform could actually, go the other way? And the key issue there for me is unanimity. If you have unanimity, then, Poland or Hungary can say, Orban can say no. And then we all have to really kind of, basically put pressure on Orban to say yes. So far, this was kind of containable because there was one or two sort of like bad apples in that cart. But if you have more, then there'd be more no's. That would be expected. That's one thing. But the other thing is, if we were to do away with unanimity, and this is the difficult framing here, would that open the floodgate to the unraveling? Or should we kind of, at this point, I know there's a big sort of like reformist push amongst federalists to say we need to do away with unanimity because it blocks so much and it kind of is in the way of democracy. And that's correct. But of course, what if democracy is hijacked by other forces? Doesn't unanimity then also protect us, protect what we've already got? Over to you.
Well, there are lots of things that I would like to say after all your provocations. No? First of all, I don't like unanimity at all, and I think it's more than conservative. It's almost stopping. And it comes from a different period of European history when we had far less countries and was possible to reach an agreement between 6, then 9, then 12. But after that, it became really hard was to get to a unanimous vote. And so one of the things actually on the table to be discussed is the treaty reform, exactly to eliminate unanimity. So the current European Parliament has already suggested a number of reforms, asking formally the opening of a convention to revise the treaties, and suggesting a number of revisions, including the elimination of unanimity. Of course, this is going to stop if the next parliament is not so much in favor of it. And so this is the first possible scenario. So a parliament with a majority against progressive European politics. I would like also to avoid every misunderstanding on the word progressive, because I'm not just talking of European Parliament elections in a left versus right dynamics, because there are many different political groups in the European Parliament, and it's perfectly fine that there are socialist groups as well as liberal groups or conservative groups. What is our concern is basically nationalist populism. So it's at the right of the liberals, of the conservatives. That's what's worrisome, because if they are nationalist in nature, they will obviously be against the most European solutions. And this is the risk that we are discussing about. And this is the possibility that we move backward in the European politics. Of course, in this case, we have to see how these groups are able to work together. And this is the first question mark. And I'm also wondering if the national nationalism. Pardon me the wording. Could evolve in European nationalism, which I don't like either, but would be different because this means we remain an integrated bloc, but we become a fortress. So we start having a more aggressive borders control, for instance, less solidarity towards the rest of the world. This is another possible scenario. And well, my hope is a different one. My hope is that whoever will be elected, once he's in Brussels and in Strasbourg, start seeing politics from a different perspective from the national one. Because I've seen this in several, let's say, moderate conservative politicians, that they learn the European perspective. Because in national politics, you don't see that. But when you get into the Brussels or Strasbourg hemicycle, you start to comparing your perspective with that of the other MPs from other countries, even in your political group. And it's sort of a school in European politics and European perspective. So some of them maybe will enlarge their perspective, but some maybe will just be there to damage. So we really don't know much about this evolution. For instance, we had in Italy this strange experience with a right for the first time government with three different right-wing parties, very different among them. And what was the one which expressed the president of the council, Giorgia Meloni, was actually considered quite a nationalist party. I think still is actually, but Giorgia Meloni herself doesn't push forward nationalist positions in the international fora, basically because maybe it doesn't help with the legitimizing herself in the multinational fora like the G7, the G20, or in the European politics. So I think she has softened it because her role is a one which comes with much power, much responsibility, and can be exercised in a fruitful way much better if you are not an extremist. And so it changed. I mean, it's what she says now is not what she used to say when she was in electoral campaign. So I also wonder which kind of chameleontic expressions we will see of these right-wing parties.
Absolutely. I mean, from where I'm standing, I can sort of see two, if you like, visions or two models for Europe. And one is sort of a distinctly, if you like, a sort of a populist model, to use that, but you could also call it an authoritarian model, or you could call it a nationalist model. And the other one is a kind of a federalist or kind of a liberal model. And the two models are, one is, if you like, the European Union that we've been building. And of course, the division there goes much further, and the division obviously has already solved some of the problems that we're struggling with. But there's a sort of a vision of Europe which sees us as a European Union, as a supranational democracy, and possibly as a Europe of regions rather than of nation states, and so on and so on. So that's one model. And there's another model, and I think Meloni is, one of the advocates of this model, and that's a sort of what she calls a sort of a League of Nations. And the League of Nations still very much looks like Europe, because it still is a kind of a conglomeration of nations, but it has a very different operating logic. And maybe just for the sake of understanding, as a compass for voters to to understand what they're voting for ultimately, could you in very, very short terms explain the difference between the federalist model of Europe that we are kind of taking for granted, or that we would like to see, and the sort of the League of Nations that the likes of Le Pen and Meloni and so on are dreaming about? Could you just make that distinction very clear so that when people hear these politicians talk, that they can pinpoint and say, aha, she's now talking about a League of Nations, or aha, he's now talking about a federalist Europe? Can you just give us a few bullet points that distinguish the two models?
Well, I completely agree. There are two different models, and in the political communication, they get confused often. And it has always been so. I remember when I studied the period of Charles de Gaulle, for instance, l'Europe des patries, which is very much the League of Nations as well. The idea that instead of having a process of integration where there is a majority rule and a significant role of supranational bodies, such as the Parliament, the Commission, the Court of Justice, the focus, the center of the European politics is the Council and the European Council, which means keeping most of the decisions in the hand of states and under the unanimity rules. So when we hear, for instance, wording like, we will do what we can in European politics in our best interest, this is League of Nations. Each of one pursuing their best interest and moving together only when these personal best interests align, which means not so often in the end. So this is definitely a Europe which makes less at any level, internal, external. So it's a minimal Europe, and it may still be a sort of agreement of, let's say, mutual support. One is attacked, the other support, which is okay. It's very much like also the leagues of the president centuries, let's say, the pacts of mutual defense and so on, but is not really creating a common feeling of being European and building something European, which is has been until now the leading idea behind the European Union. So having advanced standards for the protection of citizens, of consumers, on the environment, which means not aligning on the bottom, but trying to move all towards the top, let's say. So it's a completely different perspective.
During the Cold War years, there was two unions in Europe, wasn't there? There was what we call the European Union, and there was what we call the Soviet Union. We tend to forget that there was a Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was, of course, a union of sorts. But to me, that looked very much as a League of Nations with a very strong nation at the center, Russia. And I wonder whether the sort of this notion of the League of Nations that some people on the right promote, and at the same time the sympathies for Putin, which kind of often coincide, whether there is a sort of a longing for a kind of a European equivalent of a Soviet Union, possibly with a Germany or a France or an Italy at its core, at its center. Because of course, as you say, the kind of the knee-jerk reaction of every nationalist would be my country first. And of course, then it's a question of, it's survival for the fittest, and it is a very Darwinist model in that sense. And what you may end up with is a sort of something that doesn't look too dissimilar to, or a bit like, the Soviet Union. Is it a kind of a fair kind of, I know it's scaremongering, I know it's a sort of but I think we need to be clear where this kind of League of Union is headed, because it's not one that's based on a sense of balance and equality among those nations, is it?
Well, I think it's important to pinpoint that nationalism is in itself not really democratic. It's illiberal, because as far as we say we first, we are saying to the others you after, which means not being on equal footing about rights, about freedoms. So this is discrimination in substance. And as the union was built on the idea of non-discriminating among citizens, I think it is among its founding values not being illiberal. So, and if you read Article 2 of the treaty establishing the European Union, you see there that the values of the Union are democracy, the rule of law, pluralism, rights of minorities, equality between men and women, and protection of minors and whatever. So the fundamental rights are at the core of the Union. And I think that if we can keep this core, and rule of law as well, if we can keep this core safe, then we can also manage to live together with these, let's say, extremist parties, as far as they accept. Well, it's a contradiction in terms, maybe, but you know, if you're part of this play, you're part of this play. These are the rules of the play. Otherwise, you are going to break the toy, the union itself. And I think that, as the Court of Justice stated only 1 year ago in two famous cases against Hungary and Poland about the rule of law, the identity of the union is in its Article 2. Rule of law is part of the identity of the union. So it's something on which the union cannot compromise. This is the Court of Justice stating that. And so I think as much as we can keep this core safe, we can feel quite reassured. I mean, also we have also a Court of Justice which could declare illegal some behaviors or some, but still, after you invited me to this talk, I looked for rules internal to the European Parliament to see if there are limitations to the, let's say, freedom of expression. You know, that freedom of expression is something quite tricky, because we also wonder often when we discuss about democracy, if the democracy has the right to defend itself. So to limit the freedom of expression when this expression is against democracy, or limiting the others people's freedoms of expression. And I first of all, I looked on the rules about political groups, because political groups are financially supported by the European Parliament. And there I didn't find anything really significant, because the support is mostly an administrative support, a financing to support the functioning of the groups. But then I found something interesting. I found that there is an authority for European political parties and European political foundations, which supports the federation of parties running for the European elections, and also with substantial contributions to repay the expenses of their electoral campaigns. And there I found something interesting, because parties to apply for this funding have to be registered on this authority, and the regulation establishing the authority and also the procedures states that they have to respect certain conditions. And among these conditions, there is the Article 2, so the founding values of the Union. So even if these political parties could express political groups in the European Parliament, in theory, even if until now it have never been applied, they could see refused the funding for the electoral expenses if they don't comply with Article 2, which is interesting. And also,
and sorry, just on that point. So how would that be enforced? Would that be a decision of the council to enforce it, or would that be the court?
No, it's up to this independent authority to deny funding. And okay. So there is a French lawyer who is the director of this authority. There is, of course, a board. And I also found already 3 decisions denying funding in the previous 5 years legislature. And interesting enough, all the 3 were about extreme right political groups, 2 about parties and 1 about the foundation. But, and also this is interesting, the denial was not grounded on Article 2, was grounded on non-compliance with other, let's say, bureaucratic requirements. But it's interesting that this kind of parties, nonetheless.
It's very interesting, and it's because, of course, that very debate, the extent to which we can use our legal systems and the court system to protect democracy. This is really a live debate in Germany with regards to the AfD, both with individual candidates. There's an attempt being made at the moment to stop Höcke from being a candidate. He's a very right-wing AfD politician. And it's going to be interesting to see to literally deprive him of his of his foundational rights, the right to stand as a candidate in an election. So that's interesting. And of course, these debates are very alive in the US with regards to Donald Trump. And so this is a really interesting question. And of course, for any Democrat, there must be a sort of a sense, well, but how democratic is that? Shouldn't it be the people who decide rather than the courts who can stand? And what is your take on that? Where do you draw the line? Well, what is your way of assessing whether somebody or a party or a candidate should be stopped? And how do you assess that?
Well, I'm perfectly aware that it's very difficult, because the first reaction is you are denying my freedom of expression. So you have to draw the line, I think, when the speech, or better, the written declaration or position papers, policy papers, whatever, really attack rights of minorities, rights of foreigners, rights of gender-oriented different groups. You need some evidence that there is an aggression on fundamental rights. But interesting enough, of course, it's interesting having an independent authority doing this check. But of course, the decisions by an independent authority can always be attacked in front of the Court of Justice, because they are legal European acts. So if these groups didn't do that, it means they didn't have any ground to do that. So it was, of course, in this case, it was quite easy because they didn't fulfill some requirements. But it could be a formula interesting to apply also at national level, I think, because in all our European countries, we risk this kind of extremism and the possible regressions on fundamental rights and liberties. So it's a very hot topic at this moment.
I mean, it's interesting. I've just thinking about football, of all things. I was thinking about football, and I was thinking about how much skill it takes, and like for a team to win a football game, how much sort of like collective genius and collaboration and strategy and all that, and individual skill it takes. And of course, it all happens within a set of rules, and there's a referee. And if somebody kind of breaks those rules, the audience knows the rules, and they may say, oh, I didn't see this, or we may have to look at the video evidence for that. Or so there may be discussions around whether the rule was actually broken. But then nobody would question the idea that there should be rules in football. And that if somebody blatantly breaks those rules, that a red card will disqualify this person for the next game or for the next season or forever from playing football. Now, the problem, of course, is if there were rules that nobody knows about, and we've been playing football for 100 years, and all of a sudden a referee says, hold on, there is this rule, I tell you, it's there, and this goal doesn't count. And at that point, people will quite, rightly be annoyed. And I think when you think about democracy, I think there is this kind of fundamental misunderstanding that it is a free-for-all. It isn't. It is in that sense a bit like football. And there are players on the field, and we call them politicians, and there is an audience, and they are playing, and some score and some don't, and some behave badly and some don't. And there are referees, judges, and so on and so forth. And indeed, we have them within our political parties as well. They're also referees who make sure that party discipline is maintained, and so on and so forth. So we have those rules, but for some reason we are quite wary about applying them. And I wonder why that is. I mean, in football we aren't. And surely we're all very passionate about football, and if it's okay to have rules in football, why shouldn't we have them in democratic politics? So this is my kind of take on this. And maybe the strategy should be not so much about, oh, should we have rules or should we not? But we should have an open and a very transparent debate about what the rules of the game are and what it actually means to be a politician. If a doctor was to lie blatantly to a patient, he would basically be breaching his rule of conduct. He must be honest with the patient. And so you could imagine that a politician may have to be honest with the people that vote for him or her. So in that way, so that's my kind of take on this. And And I think, with this kind of and of course, it is entirely in the interest of populists not to have those rules, and to have the riot instead. But I think if we kind of keep this example of the football field in our minds, then the vast majority of people in a democracy will accept that rules are fundamental to every game.
I totally agree, and I think it's a wonderful example, the one of football, because well, without rules we don't have democracy. And I think there are two interesting considerations which came to my mind. One is that we need to make these rules more known, we need more knowledge about these rules.
Awareness,
because
yes.
we take democracy for granted, but without those rules it wouldn't work. So I think that the fundamental rights and liberties, as well as rule of law, these are the basic rules of democracy, and everybody should know that. And so we have a problem of communication, of education there, and you know better than anyone else, because democracy school is about that, I think, no? And the second thing is that the European, in brackets, the European solution is using money. So denying money to these parties who violate rules, as well as, for instance, the rule of law in Europe, the big problem caused by Poland and Hungary until the latest European Polish elections, which made only Hungary the bad boy, but they were two. We had a long period of discussion how to make these countries comply with basic European fundamental values. And we have a procedure set up for that, which didn't work, because the Article 7 procedure is a unanimous vote, with the exception of the country under procedure. So these two countries defended each other and didn't work. And then the other countries came up with a solution, the budget regulation applying conditionality to European funds. And so this was the way to sanction Hungary, denying European funds. And it's the same way we find for European political parties. So maybe the idea is that you need some kind of sanction. And so the economic sanction in Europe is maybe the one which is considered less, let's say, politically sensitive. Because I remember in the Turkey of 20 years ago, there was a sort of high court dissolving Islamic parties, because according to the constitution, there couldn't be place in a like country for Islamic parties, and they had this high authority dissolving parties. I think it's difficult to defend this kind of bodies, even if they worked quite well for Turkey, maybe, because you are easily condemned as you're putting somebody outside the game instead of just raising a yellow or red card. So instead of disqualifying, which is maybe too strong if you don't have anything in the middle. So the economic sanction could be a way to raising a card, like in a football match.
No, absolutely. I mean, in a way, it would be quite an interesting project, I think, to think about the rules of the game in democracy, and to do this in such a way that it becomes that it becomes clear. The thing about, going back to the football analogy once more, rules in football have different purposes. There are clearly rules that protect the health of the players, that they don't break their bones or injure themselves badly. There are other rules which are about fairness, so that both sides have an equal, chance of winning the game. And there's other rules again, which are kind of maintaining, if you like, the drama of the sport. And of course, the governing body who oversees the rules in any sport is aware of these different dimensions, and they do want football or any sport to be entertaining, because they know they need an audience for it. It's part of the sport. So it's not about making it a technocratic nightmare that nobody enjoys anymore, but it's balancing those different interests and those different duties, so that at the end, a really interesting and a sustainable sport can emerge from that. And I think it's a sort of a thing that we really should think about, then it should be part of school education, so that in the same way as people know about football and the rules, they should know about democracy and the rules. And it would also make it more exciting, because once you understand the rules, you know how to play it too. And it's more easy to then to get involved in the right kind of way. So I think this is a thing that really needs to, we should really think about. Now, when you think about, there was a very, very interesting article in the New York Times a few months back, and I think it was some kind of Harvard professor who wrote the article, and he was basically saying that the media, and this is a kind of a sort of a really an important component of any democracy, that the media play an important role also in protecting democracy. And of course, the question is, how do the media, and by extension also social media, how do they actually meet that mandate of protecting democracy so that it is there for us to enjoy for a long time to come? And at one point he was making, apart from the kind of the regulations around freedom of speech, he said, there was that media have sort of a narrative agendas, and that certainly in the US, sort of over the last couple of years, in fact, with Trump sort of on the rise, the focus is very much on, it was like betting the odds. What are the odds for him winning versus Biden winning? And it was very much about the odds. It was almost like being at the race course. And this article basically made this point that the media also have a responsibility to talk about the outcomes. In other words, what is it? What are you going to get as a result of your vote? If it's all just about this versus that, and you don't really think too hard about the outcome, that really opens the door for populists, because you're never really going to question any of these phony promises that populists make. They just become part of the race. That is an argument winning over, and you don't actually think about, what that actually means. A, whether it's at all feasible, and B, if it happens, what that actually then does, and what the kind of unintended consequences of that policy then are. So in a way, that switch from kind of thinking about the odds who's going to win to what are the outcomes of this win versus that. But I think that's also a very important one. So I would like to end our dialogue just focusing on what is at stake at these elections in Europe.
Maybe it's Europe itself.
No, yeah, that's right. You have talked a little bit already about sort of the sort of next gen Europe. But of course, that next gen Europe might be stopped in its tracks by sort of a massive shift to the right. So I would like you to finish off to tell us a little bit more about that next gen Europe might look like.
Well, the next European Parliament will have a heavy political agenda, because after appointing the Commission, it will deal right away with the decision or not to revise the treaties, or pushing or not to revise the treaties. So this is a major decision. Then we have a number of unfinished, let's say, law packages about environment and climate, about energy, about migration. So there are a number of legislative procedures which will be still pending on this dossier. So I think the European Parliament has quite a big responsibility to deal with, especially about environmental and climate, as we are running out of time. And of course, we have a number of unresolved problems about foreign policy, because the two current wars have opened up a Pandora box about the possibility of Europe to be able to build peace not only inside of it, but outside of it. And so I think that a major part of this possible revision of the treaties will be about foreign and security policy, and the way Europe decides to play as a global actor. So I think what is at stake is much more than what is at stake in national elections. And it's a pity that most of European citizens still think that European elections are less important than national ones, and often debate about national problems when in the electoral European campaign, when there are many huge European problems. One of them is the one you mentioned about the independence of media, because they play a major role in safeguarding democracy, the independence and the pluralism of media. And we have very clear rules, antitrust rules, for instance, to avoid the concentration of power, and also legal responsibility of directors for what is published. But when the information runs more on the social media than on traditional media, we don't have rules about that. And we cannot control the flux of money. And this is also in strident, let's say, contrast in opposition with what are our rules about political campaigns, which have roofs of money that can come from single contributors, and there are no roofs of money that can be spent on the media to push for a candidate or to publish certain real or fake news about manipulating public opinion. So I think it's not only every election is more risky than the previous one, because we have this technological advancement which is not paralleled by adequate legal advancement. But there are every 5 years we have bigger and bigger issues in the European Union to solve. And so I'm quite worried, I confess. And I think that I hope that a number of these future MPs, which for sure will come from the right-wing parties, will learn to be a bit more European, and we'll see also the other perspective, the perspective from Brussels and from Strasbourg.
Absolutely. I mean, I think like media is a really important example, and the whole, privacy and everything that kind of goes with that now as well. And of course, another, you touched on that as well, of course, is defense policy and foreign policy. And you can't really think one without the other. They are very closely, of course, linked. And so, and we see it in Ukraine, we see it in our relationship, to China. And we see it increasingly in our relationship to the US. And in fact, the US may well be the trigger for much more integrated Europe around sort of like a shared interest in defense. But these are the issues at stake at this upcoming election. And I think it's really, as you absolutely say, it's important that we stop talking about, at this election, stop talking about national issues and focus on European issues. And there is a national dimension to every one of those European issues, of course, because of course Poland will be a lot safer if there's an integrated European defense policy. The Baltic states will be a lot safer if there's an integrated European defense policy. Taiwan will have a much greater chance of remaining a democracy if there is a unified European foreign policy, and so on and so forth. And we see it in so many parts of the world where we could do so much good if we had that unified single voice, which at the moment we unfortunately still lack. So I'm aware that we're kind of out of time. So what is your message, if you have one, for people who are still not decided on how to vote at that election?
Well, the messages are basically two. Go to vote, because unfortunately we have lower and lower rates of voters in Europe, and this means that there are less people engaged or believing in politics. So it's important to be part of the process, otherwise you cannot complain with the results. At least you have the right to complain if you're part. Second message is try to find out what is the European program for the European candidates at European elections. Even if it's your local district candidate, you should ask, if you have the opportunity, or question at least, what they are going to do in Europe and for Europe, not which is the perspective on national politics, because it's different. I mean, there are different things to be discussed, and you should discover their European programs.
Absolutely. Susanna, thank you ever so much. This was really, really interesting. And I'm really glad that you have come on to talk to me. And I'm aware that you're in the middle of a different project at the moment in Poland. So thank you very much for interrupting what you're doing at the moment. Best of luck. And again, thanks a lot for coming on to Reboot 2030. I hope we can continue that conversation in the not too distant future. Maybe after the elections, once we know, how this has worked out, and we can talk about, how to move forward from there.
Thank you so much for having me, Nico, for the invitation. It is always a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And just one last pitch, maybe. I know you've got your supranational democracy dialogues coming up.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a few words about that and maybe tell people how they can register or how they can get involved?
Yes, this is an event that I've been organizing since 2018. It's a conference called Supranational Democracy Dialogue. It's a dialogue among interested scholars, activists, experts, international officials about how democracy can work beyond our borders, so at European and at global level. So it's a very open conversation. It's an open event. Everybody can register. There are no attending fees. And all the previous editions are integrally on YouTube if you want to listen to them. And we will have a page of Universidad del Salento with the program and the link to register. It's still not up. We are still working on the program, but just look for Supranational Democracy Dialogue 2024 and you will find it. Excellent. It's May 2-3.
Excellent. Now, two things. First of all, of course, it happens in Brindisi, which is the very south of Italy, which is one of the most beautiful parts in this world. I can't imagine a more beautiful location for a conference, and I presume presumably the food is going to be just as good. So I can really only encourage people to to have a look at this. And of course, also it happens prior to the European elections, and I believe you also have a strand focusing on the European elections, and of course that in a way is kind of giving the whole thing a bit of a sort of a perspective, isn't it? So maybe, do you have a broad sense of what the program is going to be about?
Yes, we will have two main sessions, one about Europe in the world and one about global institutions. But what is interesting is that we will have also 4 working groups. And one of these is on European politics and European elections. Another is about democracy and technology. Another is about climate. And the 4th is about war and peace. So, and all the attendants will be invited to interact with each other. And so everybody will contribute to the dialogue in a way.
Excellent. And of course, it's a wonderfully kind of international kind of mix of people. From what I go, they come from all over Europe, from Greece, from Germany, you name it, of course, also from Italy. What other kind of countries are people coming from? Do you have a sort of a sense of what the mix is going to be like this year?
Well, we have still to build the program, but we have always a significant representation of all Europe. So from very east to from very west, from Spain to also candidate countries, Albania, Montenegro, and we have also had in the past several people from United States, from Israel, also from other parts of the world. But every time it's quite a surprise because we don't know who will show up in the end. And there is every year there is a call for papers. So it's also the panelists are not picked up from us. We just select from those who want to come. And we have also the interesting thing is that in Brindisi there are two important UN bases. One is the UNGC, UN General Service Center, which is in charge of all the peacekeeping of the world, actually. It's directly related to the Security Council in New York. And the other is the operative base of the WFP, World Food Program, so the humanitarian aid in case of catastrophes. And so we have also participants from these two UN interesting environments. And we have a couple of interesting partnerships. We have many partners from civil society, but I will mention just 2 because they are very significant. The Democracy and Culture Foundations from Athens, which organize every year the Athens Democracy Forum. And the other interesting one is the Jean Monnet House in Paris, which is a training center of the European Parliament, beyond being also the house of Jean Monnet, father of European integration. So, and you see, these are very two different partners, but they show, you see how this all this is related to democracy and the beyond borders dimension.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this sounds like a really, really interesting mix. And of course, although you are yourself a serious academic and a professor, full professor of, sort of a brilliant university, this is not just an academic conference, is it? It is a kind of a mix. It cuts across academia, civil society, sort of activism. So it's quite an interesting platform, and if people have an interest in contributing to it, they don't have to be academics, do they?
Exactly. The idea is exactly building bridges between these different environments, because we academicians need to learn from people in the field the real problems and the real challenges, as well as we need to also want to contribute with our knowledge to the activity of civil society, building common projects, so have an impact with our work on these topics. So the idea is exactly being a sort of place for cross-fertilization, let's say.
Absolutely brilliantly. And of course, it's an ongoing dialogue. So it happens every year. So there is a kind of also, there's sort of an element of maintaining relationships and kind of seeing people again, and it's sort of a kind of a family affair as well at the same time. Susanna, thank you ever so much. I hope that some of the listeners and viewers that are sort of tuning in will be inspired and will get in touch. What I will do is I'll stick the link for the registration below the video if you send that to me, and then people, if they're interested, they can just click on that link and basically register.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Susanna, thank you very much for being with us on Reboot 2030. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure, Nico. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.